Jake Thompson was in the middle of his usual day, tending to his farmland under the warm sun. The steady rhythm of his work had become second nature to him, a mix of muscle memory and a love for the land that had been passed down through generations. As he drove his tractor along the edge of the field, he heard an abrupt, loud crash in the distance. The sound cut through the stillness, startling him. He stopped, listening. After a brief pause, he decided to investigate, hoping it wasn't as bad as it had sounded. Rushing over to the source of the noise, Jake found a car, a sleek, shiny sports model he didn't immediately recognize, wrapped around a tree just beyond the edge of his property. His heart raced as he approached the vehicle, seeing the driver's side crumpled in, glass shattered all around. Inside, a man lay unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The scene looked grim, and Jake's instincts kicked in. He carefully pulled the door open, minding the sharp edges of twisted metal, and tried to wake the man, who seemed to be breathing, but unresponsive. "Hang in there, buddy," Jake murmured, pulling out his phone to dial 911. While he waited for the ambulance, he tried to stop the bleeding with a clean cloth he carried in his pocket, pressing it gently to the man's forehead. He spoke reassuringly to him, hoping the sound of a voice might stir him. Before long, sirens echoed in the distance, and Jake waved down the approaching ambulance, directing them to the scene. He stayed long enough to help load the man onto the stretcher, his mind already buzzing with questions. Later that evening, Jake couldn't shake the accident from his thoughts. He'd been to the hospital to check on the man, now identified as Victor Reynolds, a billionaire from the city. Jake hadn't expected anything, but he felt compelled to make sure Victor was okay. When he arrived, Victor was awake, though still dazed. As Jake entered the hospital room, Victor's face lit up with a weak smile. "You saved my life out there," Victor said, his voice grateful yet tired. Jake brushed it off, saying he'd done what anyone would. But Victor seemed deeply affected, looking at Jake with a seriousness that took him by surprise. "I owe you more than just a thank you. When I'm back on my feet, I want to do something for you. Something big." Jake chuckled, uncomfortable with the idea. He tried to explain that he didn't need anything, but Victor insisted. "I mean it, Jake. You'll see. I don't do things halfway." The next morning, Jake went about his routine, assuming the incident was behind him. But as he stepped out of his farmhouse, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, sitting in his driveway, was a brand new, vibrant red Ferrari. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, almost expecting it to disappear. But it didn't. A sleek note on the windshield caught his attention, and he walked over, pulling the card free. It read, "Jake, thank you for what you did. Enjoy the ride. Victor." He stood there, bewildered, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the extravagant gift. Jake had never dreamed of owning a car like this. He barely recognized the model, but he knew enough to understand that it was worth more than his entire farm. For a moment, he felt a rush of excitement, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of unease. Why would Victor give him something so over the top? He hadn't asked for anything in return, yet here was this glaring symbol of wealth and luxury, parked outside his humble farmhouse. Jake ran his hand over the car's glossy hood, feeling the smooth metal under his fingers. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into someone else's life. He glanced around, half expecting his neighbors to come out and gawk, but the area was silent. The Ferrari seemed completely out of place against the backdrop of his modest farm, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. As days passed, Jake's unease about the Ferrari only grew. He couldn't help but feel out of place every time he saw the sleek red car sitting in his driveway, a glaring contrast to his rustic life. Questions buzzed in his mind, particularly about Victor Reynolds, the man who'd given him the car. Who was this billionaire, really? Jake hadn't heard much about him before the accident, but now he wanted to know more about the man who seemed to have so much wealth that a Ferrari was just a casual gift. He started by asking around town, speaking to people who might know a thing or two about Victor's reputation. A few locals had heard of Victor, though mostly through snippets of gossip. At the general store, Jake met up with Sam, an old friend who often kept up with news outside their small town. Sam gave him a knowing look when Jake mentioned Victor Reynolds. "Ah, the city slicker who loves his flashy cars," Sam said, shaking his head. "That man's got a reputation, Jake. Lives alone in that huge mansion up north. They say he spends his days hopping from one high-class party to the next. Some folks say he got rich through some big tech deals. Others say he's just good at throwing money around." The more Jake heard, the more he wondered. Why had a man like Victor ended up in his small town that day? And why had he given Jake such an extravagant gift? Intrigued, Jake went home and decided to do a little research. It wasn't often that he used the internet for much beyond checking crop prices and weather reports, but now he was determined to learn what he could. He typed Victor Reynolds billionaire into the search bar and began scrolling through articles, images, and videos. He found stories about Victor's business empire, technology startups, high-stakes investments, and rumored connections to some of the biggest names in the corporate world. There were pictures of him at exclusive events, always dressed impeccably, surrounded by the glamorous and powerful. But as Jake continued reading, he noticed a recurring theme. Victor appeared wealthy, but isolated. Several interviews hinted that he was an intensely private person who kept others at arm's length. After spending a few hours online, Jake needed a break. He headed to the local cafe to clear his mind, only to overhear a conversation between two patrons. They were talking about Victor Reynolds and how his wealth seemed more like a prison than a privilege. Jake sipped his coffee, listening as one of the men remarked, "He might have all the money in the world, but that guy looks like he carries the weight of it on his shoulders. He's been here before, you know. Rumor has it he comes out to these quiet places when he's looking to escape." Jake mulled over these words. It seemed like Victor's wealth came with its own set of troubles, ones that might have driven him to the edge of a small-town farm road. He thought back to the look on Victor's face in the hospital, that strange intensity, almost a desperation. Perhaps the gift of the Ferrari was more than just an extravagant thank you. It might have been Victor's way of transferring some piece of himself, a part of his reality, onto someone else. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about gratitude. It was about escape. Over the next few days, Jake wrestled with what to do about the car. Part of him was tempted to sell it, thinking of the improvements he could make to the farm with that kind of money. But another part of him felt a pang of guilt at the thought. Selling it might feel like he was betraying Victor's gesture, even if it was a strange one. Yet, keeping it seemed even more problematic. People in town were starting to notice the car, and whispers had begun circulating. His neighbors looked at him differently now, with a mixture of envy and curiosity, and some even stopped by under the pretense of casual conversation, their eyes lingering on the Ferrari. Late one night, as he sat on his porch gazing at the car, he found himself asking out loud, "What am I supposed to do with you?" He was torn. The Ferrari felt like a symbol of everything he wasn't, a life he didn't belong to. And yet, he felt reluctant to just give it up. The car had brought a sense of adventure, an unexpected thrill, but it also seemed to carry a weight he wasn't sure he wanted. He felt trapped in a decision he hadn't asked for, wondering if keeping the car would change who he was, or if giving it up would make him look like he wasn't grateful. As Jake pondered these questions, he realized that the Ferrari wasn't just a car. It was a test of his values, a challenge to everything he believed about himself. He had spent his whole life working hard, living simply, and staying connected to the land. And now, with a single act of generosity, that world felt as if it were teetering on the edge of something unknown. The Ferrari had brought more than just luxury into his life. It had brought a choice, and Jake wasn't sure he was ready to make it. One evening, Jake decided to take the Ferrari out for a drive, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the thrill of it would settle his indecision. He hadn't planned on stopping by Emily's place, but when he saw her outside working in her garden, he pulled over. Emily, his neighbor and longtime friend, was one of the few people in town who hadn't commented on the car. She was always down to earth, and he appreciated her level-headedness. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "Is that really you, Jake?" she teased, walking over with a playful grin. "I hardly recognized you in that thing. Quite the upgrade from your old truck." Jake laughed, rubbing the back of his neck, suddenly feeling a bit self-conscious. It's a long story. But, want to take it for a spin?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the Ferrari, then back at Jake. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, and it made her curious. She shrugged, wiping her hands on her jeans before climbing into the passenger seat. As they sped down the country roads, Emily's laughter filled the car. The powerful engine roared beneath them, and for a brief moment, Jake felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. He watched Emily's expression, seeing a side of her he hadn't noticed before. A spark, a hint of adventure. Yet, as they returned to her house, Emily's expression grew thoughtful. "It's an incredible car, Jake. But don't you think it's a little much?" she asked, looking at him carefully. Jake nodded, sighing. "I don't know what to think anymore. This whole thing, it's thrown me off balance. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, and I'm not sure if I should even keep it." Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just remember, Jake, a car like this might turn heads, but it doesn't change who you are. If anything, it just puts you in the spotlight. And from what I know, you've always preferred a simpler life." After their drive, Jake and Emily sat on her porch, watching the last light fade over the fields. They talked about the past, about how they both grew up in the same small town, and how they had always shared similar values. As the conversation deepened, Emily opened up about her own struggles. She admitted that she often felt out of place in town, torn between the desire for a quiet life and the pull of the city. She'd once dreamed of leaving, but somehow she never had. "Funny, isn't it?" she said, gazing up at the stars. "You've got this incredible car, a taste of something different, and I'm still here, wondering if I missed my chance to see the world." Jake turned to her, his own thoughts echoing hers. "Maybe we're not as different as I thought. I always figured I'd be content here forever. But now I'm wondering what else is out there. This car, it's stirring things up, making me question everything." Emily nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Maybe that's a good thing, Jake. Sometimes we need something to shake us out of our routine, but don't let it take you away from what matters. Money, fancy cars, they come and go. But happiness, that's a different kind of wealth." Jake felt a warmth growing between them, a connection that had been there all along, but never fully acknowledged. As they sat in silence, he realized that perhaps Emily was the one person who truly understood what he was going through. The Ferrari had brought them closer, not because of its allure, but because it forced them to confront their dreams and insecurities. Jake reached for her hand, and she squeezed it gently, a gesture of comfort and understanding. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Emily's friendship blossomed into something deeper. They spent more time together, often talking late into the night about their hopes, fears, and what they wanted out of life. Yet, Jake couldn't ignore the growing attention he was receiving from others. With the Ferrari came a level of admiration and envy he hadn't anticipated, and it affected his relationship with Emily in subtle ways. One afternoon, as they walked through town, he noticed people staring, some even stopping to take pictures of the car, as if it were a celebrity itself. He felt a wave of discomfort, and Emily seemed to sense it too. At one point, a group of young men approached, more interested in the car than in Jake himself. They peppered him with questions about its speed, its cost, and whether he'd let them take it for a spin. Jake forced a smile, trying to be polite, but he could see Emily's smile fading, a look of unease crossing her face. Later, she confronted him about it. "Jake, I don't want to sound ungrateful or anything, but this car, it's bringing out a side of people I'm not used to seeing, and I can't help but feel like it's changing things between us. I just want to make sure you're still the same person I know." Jake took her words to heart, recognizing the truth in them. He had let the car take up more space in his life than he'd intended. He reassured Emily, explaining that he hadn't changed, that the car was just a temporary part of his life. But deep down, he wondered if he was convincing himself as much as he was her. The Ferrari had drawn attention, but it was also a barrier, one that seemed to separate him from the genuine connections he valued most. As he watched Emily walk away that evening, he felt a pang of regret. The car, which he had initially viewed as a gift, was now complicating his relationships. He realized that if he wasn't careful, he could lose more than just a sense of normalcy. He could lose the people who truly mattered to him, starting with Emily. And that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. Not long after the Ferrari arrived, Jake noticed a shift in how people treated him. At first, it was subtle. His neighbors would nod politely, sometimes offering compliments on the car with a hint of curiosity in their eyes. But as the weeks passed, the Ferrari became more than just a flashy vehicle in his driveway. It became a symbol, something people in town couldn't stop talking about. Jake quickly became the center of attention, and the change in his social dynamics unsettled him. At the local diner, he found people were quick to offer him a seat or a free coffee. They asked questions about his new life with a fascination that bordered on envy. It was strange, Jake thought, because he hadn't changed at all. He still woke up early, tended his farm, and put in the same hard work as he always had. But now, people seemed to see him differently. Conversations grew less genuine, often revolving around the car rather than anything meaningful. Jake missed the days when he could walk into town and feel like just another face in the crowd. One day, as he was leaving the diner, he overheard a group of locals talking in hushed tones. "Think he'll start dressing fancy too?" one of them joked, nudging another with a smirk. Jake paused, pretending not to hear, but their words stung. They weren't laughing with him. They were laughing at him. The Ferrari had drawn a line between him and his community, and he didn't know how to bridge it. The change wasn't limited to strangers either. Even Jake's closest friends began acting differently. Hank, a childhood friend, had always been there for him, through thick and thin. But since the Ferrari's arrival, Hank had grown distant, and Jake felt the strain on their friendship. It wasn't something either of them talked about directly, but the tension was there, lurking beneath the surface. One afternoon, Jake invited Hank over to catch up, hoping to smooth things over. As they sat on Jake's porch, sharing a couple of beers, the conversation eventually turned to the Ferrari. Hank looked at the car, his expression a mixture of resentment and something Jake couldn't quite place. "So how's the high life treating you, Jake?" Hank asked, his tone light but with an edge. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a car, Hank. I didn't ask for it. I was just helping a guy who needed it." Hank shrugged, taking a long sip from his bottle. "Funny how something like that can change things. People look at you differently now. It's like you're not one of us anymore." Jake tried to laugh it off, but Hank's words struck a nerve. He realized then that the Ferrari had not only affected how others saw him, but also how he saw himself. He wasn't just Jake the farmer anymore. He was the guy with the Ferrari. And that title came with expectations he hadn't anticipated. Determined to reconnect with his friends, Jake decided to host a barbecue at his place, hoping to remind everyone of the person he really was. He set up the grill, laid out tables, and called everyone he knew, hoping for a good turnout. He wanted them to see that, despite the car in his driveway, he was still the same Jake they'd always known. As people arrived, he welcomed them warmly, moving from group to group, sharing laughs and old memories. But despite his efforts, the Ferrari remained the center of attention. Guests took pictures with it, some sitting inside and pretending to drive. A few even joked about how Jake was now too fancy for the rest of them. The light-hearted comments stung more than Jake wanted to admit. Then, a few strangers showed up, friends of friends he hadn't invited. They seemed more interested in the car than in meeting him, snapping photos and talking loudly about the luxury life they imagined he now led. Jake felt his heart sink. The event, which he'd hoped would bridge the gap, had only deepened it. Near the end of the night, he spotted Hank sitting alone by the grill, nursing a beer. Jake joined him, tired and frustrated. "This wasn't what I wanted, Hank. I just wanted things to be like they were." Hank looked at him, his expression softening for the first time. "Maybe they can be, Jake. But that car, it's not just metal and wheels. It's a reminder, you know? A reminder that maybe some people change, even if they don't mean to." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of Hank's words. He looked over at the Ferrari, shining under the porch light, and for the first time, he wondered if keeping it was worth what it was costing him. He wanted to belong in his town, to be just Jake again. But as long as that car was in his life, he feared he'd always be set apart, like an outsider in his own world. The night ended with Jake standing alone, watching the last of his guests leave. The Ferrari sat there, beautiful and powerful, but it felt like an intruder on his land. He realized that he had a decision to make, a choice between holding onto a symbol of luxury that didn't fit him or finding a way back to the simpler life he'd always cherished. As the silence of the night settled around him, Jake knew that whatever he decided, his life would never be quite the same again. Not long after the barbecue, word spread quickly about Jake's newfound status as the town's unexpected celebrity. Soon, Jake received a visit from someone he hadn't anticipated, a local real estate developer named Tom Winslow. Tom was a smooth talker, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place against the rustic backdrop of Jake's farm. He walked up to Jake with a grin, his eyes gleaming with opportunity. "Jake Thompson, the man of the hour," Tom greeted, extending a hand. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately, and that Ferrari. Talk about making a statement." Jake forced a smile, not quite sure where this was going. He invited Tom to sit on the porch, where they could talk. Tom wasted no time, diving right into his pitch. He painted a grand vision for the town, one that involved transforming Jake's farmland and the surrounding area into a luxury resort. Tom's plan included high-end hotels, spas, and golf courses, all marketed to wealthy tourists looking for an escape from city life. "Think about it, Jake," Tom said, leaning forward. "You've already got the Ferrari. Now, imagine having the cash to match it. This town's stuck in the past, but we could bring it into the future. All we need is a little investment, a few sacrifices, and this place could be the next big thing. And you, well, you'd be the man who made it happen." Jake listened, feeling a mix of temptation and unease. Tom's words stirred something in him, the possibility of a different life, one where he wasn't just a farmer scraping by, but someone with influence and wealth. But as Tom continued, Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. This plan wasn't just about him. It would impact his neighbors, the land he loved, and the quiet life that had always felt right to him. Tom's proposal lingered in Jake's mind long after the meeting. He spent days weighing his options, torn between the allure of financial gain and the loyalty he felt to his roots. The idea of the town changing so drastically was hard to swallow. Jake visited his favorite spots around his land, walking through fields he'd known since childhood, feeling the earth beneath his boots. He thought of the hours he'd spent working the soil, the pride he felt in seeing his crops grow. The thought of all that being replaced by concrete and manicured lawns made his heart ache. That evening, he called Emily to share what Tom had proposed. As they sat on her porch, she listened quietly, her face unreadable. When he finished, she finally spoke, her voice steady. "Jake, I get that this is a big opportunity, but you have to ask yourself what really matters. This land, your family's legacy, are you ready to trade that in for some quick cash and a title? Because that's what it would be, you know. You'd become another face in a suit like Tom." Jake looked at her, a pang of guilt creeping into his chest. He realized he'd almost let the temptation blind him to what was truly important. Emily's words echoed his own feelings, reinforcing the sense that he was on the brink of losing something far more valuable than money could buy. He thanked her, feeling grateful to have someone who could help him see through the haze. A few days later, Tom organized a community meeting at the town hall, inviting Jake and the rest of the townspeople to discuss the proposal. The hall was packed, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. Many of his neighbors were curious, some even excited about the possibility of job creation and an influx of tourists, but others looked uneasy, whispering among themselves about the changes that could come. Tom took the floor, delivering a polished presentation, complete with glossy images of what the town could look like after the development. He spoke of economic growth, modernization, and the promise of a brighter future. As he spoke, Jake saw the spark in some of his neighbors' eyes, the hope of something different, but he also saw the worry etched into the faces of those who had worked the land their whole lives, just like he had. When Tom finished, he turned to Jake, gesturing for him to speak. Jake stood, clearing his throat, feeling the weight of the room's gaze on him. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know some of you see this as a chance to improve our town, maybe make life a bit easier," he began, his voice steady. "But I also know that what makes this place special isn't just about money or fancy resorts. It's about the people, the land, and the traditions we've kept alive. I'm not against change, but I can't help but wonder, at what cost?" A murmur spread through the room, and Jake could sense the mixed reactions. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked disappointed, clearly swayed by the promises of wealth and progress. Tom's expression tightened, but he remained silent, letting Jake continue. "I'm not saying I have all the answers," Jake admitted, "but I do know that this land is more than just dirt. It's history, and I'm not ready to let go of that just yet." As he finished, Jake felt a surge of relief, as if he'd finally voiced the internal struggle he'd been wrestling with since the Ferrari entered his life. The town hall meeting ended with no final decision, but Jake had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who might have been too eager for change. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he felt more certain than ever about what he needed to do. Walking out of the hall, he realized that keeping the land meant staying true to himself and to the life he wanted to preserve. Tom might push harder, and there might be others who would side with him, but Jake had found his footing. The Ferrari might have changed how others saw him, but he was determined not to let it change who he was. He'd stand firm, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that some things were worth holding on to, no matter how tempting the alternatives might seem. After the town hall meeting, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He'd spoken his mind, but the decision to keep the land felt bigger than just one meeting or one flashy car. To clear his head, he spent an afternoon walking his farm, retracing the paths he'd walked as a child with his father. The familiar scent of the soil, the distant rustle of leaves, and the rhythmic buzz of insects reminded him of why he'd chosen this life. Each step brought memories. Learning to plant with his father, summer nights spent beneath the stars, the satisfaction of a hard day's work. As he wandered through the fields, Jake felt the weight of his family's legacy settle around him. Generations of Thompsons had poured their sweat and care into this land. He knelt down, scooping up a handful of earth, letting it sift through his fingers. This soil was more than just a place to grow crops. It was his heritage, his connection to a simpler, truer life. He realized that if he were to sell or develop it, he'd be cutting ties with the very thing that defined him. Sitting under an old oak tree, Jake took a deep breath, the air thick with the familiar sense of his farm. He knew what he had to do. No amount of money or luxury could replace the feeling of belonging that came from working the land. The Ferrari might be beautiful, and the prospect of wealth might be tempting, but they weren't worth giving up the life he cherished. He decided, once and for all, that the land would remain as it was, and he would hold on to his family's legacy with everything he had. That evening, Jake called Hank, feeling it was time to make amends. Their friendship had been strained since the Ferrari arrived, and he knew they needed to talk. Hank agreed to meet, and they sat on the porch, the night air filled with the quiet hum of crickets. After a moment of silence, Jake spoke up, apologizing for how things had changed between them. "Hank, I never wanted this to come between us. I know the car's caused a lot of trouble, and I hate how it's affected things. I just want you to know that no car, no amount of money, will ever mean more to me than our friendship," Jake said, his voice heavy with regret. Hank sighed, looking out into the darkness. "It's not just the car, Jake. I guess I felt like I was losing my friend. You were suddenly this guy everyone looked up to, and I didn't recognize you anymore. It felt like you were slipping away, like the town was slipping away too." Jake reached out, gripping Hank's shoulder. "I'm still me, Hank, and I'm not going anywhere. This land, this life, it's all I've ever known, and it's all I want. I've made my choice. I'm staying right here, and I want you by my side. We've been through too much to let something like this come between us." Hank nodded, a small smile breaking through his solemn expression. He knew Jake meant it, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him. The two friends sat in comfortable silence, the tension between them easing as they shared the quiet of the evening. They didn't need many words. Their history spoke for itself. With his decision made, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had resolved to stay true to himself and to the land that had always been his anchor. But there was still the matter of the Ferrari. As much as he appreciated the gesture, he knew it wasn't meant for him. The car felt like a lingering tie to a world he'd decided to leave behind, a reminder of a life he didn't want. The next morning, Jake called Victor and arranged to meet him. They agreed to meet halfway between Jake's farm and the city, in a quiet, rural diner. When Jake arrived, Victor was already waiting, looking out of place in his tailored suit against the rustic backdrop. He seemed surprised to see Jake, but greeted him warmly. "Jake, it's good to see you. I wasn't expecting a call," Victor said, motioning for him to sit. Jake got straight to the point. "Victor, I want to thank you again for the car. It was incredibly generous, and I appreciate what you did. But I can't keep it. It's just not me." Victor looked at him thoughtfully, nodding slowly. "I had a feeling you might say that. You know, when I gave you that car, I thought I was giving you a piece of the life I always wanted. Freedom, excitement. But maybe I was just trying to escape from something myself." Jake leaned forward, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Victor hesitated, then spoke with a vulnerability Jake hadn't seen before. "I grew up not far from here, in a small town. My family didn't have much, but we had each other. I left because I wanted more, and I thought money would bring me happiness. But the more I gained, the emptier I felt. I envy you, Jake. You have something I lost a long time ago. Roots, a sense of belonging. That car, it was my way of trying to reconnect, I suppose. But maybe you're right. It belongs to someone else." Jake listened, understanding Victor in a new light. He saw a man who had reached the pinnacle of wealth but had lost touch with what mattered. They talked for hours, sharing stories, and by the end, they'd formed a connection that went beyond the accident that had brought them together. When they parted, Victor left the car with Jake, insisting that he sell it or do whatever felt right. It was a gift, but also a burden lifted from both their shoulders. As Jake drove back to his farm, he felt lighter. He'd made his decision, and he'd found a way to honor both his roots and the unexpected friendship he'd formed. The Ferrari no longer felt like an obligation, but a choice he could make on his own terms. He knew he'd sell it, using the money to improve his farm and help his neighbors, grounding himself even further in the life he valued. Jake had rediscovered what truly mattered, and he was ready to let go of anything that didn't align with the man he wanted to be. With the decision to sell the Ferrari and reinvest in his farm made, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Victor's story. They had parted on friendly terms, but their conversation had left him curious. Victor's words about longing for roots and belonging resonated deeply with Jake, and he wondered if there was more to Victor's journey than he had shared. Deciding to get a fuller picture, Jake arranged another meeting with Victor, hoping to better understand the man who had so unexpectedly entered his life. They met in a quiet cafe just outside the city, a place neither of them was likely to be recognized. Victor seemed more relaxed this time, dressed casually and looking less like a billionaire and more like someone who'd come to escape the world for a while. As they settled in, Jake leaned forward, his tone genuine. "Victor, I appreciate everything you've done. I really do. But I feel like there's a lot I don't know about you. You mentioned something about losing touch with what mattered. I can't help but wonder, what led you to this point?" Victor took a deep breath, his eyes distant as if he were sifting through memories. "Jake, I haven't been completely honest. You see, there's more to my story than just money and success. I grew up in a small town much like yours. My father was a mechanic, my mother a teacher. We didn't have much, but we were happy. I remember working with my dad, learning the trade, feeling connected to something real. But I wanted more. I wanted to break out, to make a name for myself." He paused, a flicker of regret crossing his face. "I left that life behind and started chasing wealth. It took years, but eventually, I had everything I'd dreamed of. Money, power, influence. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of why I'd started. I became obsessed with status, accumulating things that didn't mean anything. The Ferrari, it was one of many symbols I used to convince myself I was happy. But deep down, I was miserable." Victor continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "The day you saved me, I was at my lowest. I'd driven out to the country because I wanted to escape, to remember what it felt like to breathe without all that weight pressing down on me. But I was reckless, distracted. I don't know if it was an accident or if I was just looking for a way out. When you found me, it was like a wake-up call. Here was this stranger, someone who had none of the things I thought I needed, and yet you seemed content, happy even. It made me realize how empty my life had become." Jake listened, the pieces falling into place. Victor's gift of the Ferrari wasn't just an act of gratitude. It was an attempt to share something of himself, to let go of a piece of the life that had been strangling him. For Victor, the Ferrari had represented his ambitions, but also his regrets. And by giving it away, he was hoping to rid himself of those regrets, if only for a moment. "Victor," Jake said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "it sounds like you've been carrying a lot. Maybe it's time you reconnect with those roots you left behind. Money and power, they're tools, but they don't have to define you." Victor looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You know, Jake, I think you're right. Meeting you, seeing how you live, it's reminded me of what I once had, what I've been missing all these years. Maybe it's time I find my way back to something real, something that gives me purpose again." Their conversation took on a lighter tone as they discussed the future, the possibilities that lay ahead. Victor shared his plans to step back from his business, to spend more time finding the kind of peace he'd seen in Jake's life. He spoke of starting a foundation to support small towns, to preserve farmland, and to give back to communities like the one he'd come from. As they said their goodbyes, Jake felt a sense of closure. He had come to understand that Victor's gift was more than just a car. It was a reminder of life's true wealth, which lay not in possessions, but in the connections and values that shape who we are. For Victor, the Ferrari had been a burden, a symbol of a life he no longer wanted. But through this strange series of events, both men had gained a renewed sense of purpose. Returning home, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude. He looked out over his fields, realizing that everything he needed was already right in front of him. The Ferrari would be sold, the money reinvested into his farm and community, and Victor's story would remain with him as a reminder of the choices he'd made. Jake had reaffirmed his commitment to a life of simplicity, hard work, and connection to the land. He'd gained a friend in Victor, and perhaps even helped him find a path back to happiness. For Jake, this experience had reinforced what he'd known all along. True wealth wasn't about flashy cars or big bank accounts. It was about living authentically, grounded in the values that mattered most. And with that, Jake returned to his farm, ready to embrace the life he loved, more confident than ever that he was exactly where he belonged. With the decision to sell the Ferrari made, Jake felt an unexpected mix of relief and excitement. He hadn't thought much about what he'd do with the money, but now he saw an opportunity to reinvest in his farm and give back to the community that had supported him for so long. His mind buzzed with ideas, from upgrading his equipment to donating to local projects. He decided to sell the car in a way that would benefit the town as much as himself, and after some consideration, he organized a small town event where he'd auction off the Ferrari to the highest bidder. Word spread quickly, and on the day of the event, people from all over the county showed up. The auction created a festive atmosphere, with local vendors setting up booths and neighbors catching up over shared memories. Jake felt a sense of pride as he looked around, knowing he was doing something positive for his community. Even as potential buyers inspected the car, he was approached by people who thanked him for his generosity, excited about how the proceeds would benefit the town. As the auction began, Jake felt a surge of emotions. He watched as the bids climbed, surprised by how much interest the Ferrari had garnered. Finally, after a flurry of bidding, the car was sold to a collector from a nearby city. The sum was significant, more than Jake had ever dreamed he'd have at his disposal. Yet, as he signed over the title, he didn't feel a sense of loss. The car had always been a strange fit in his life, and he felt grateful to see it go to someone who truly valued it for what it was. With the funds from the sale, Jake made good on his plans. He started by upgrading the farm's infrastructure, purchasing new tools, and modernizing his equipment to make his work more efficient. But he didn't stop there. Jake set aside a portion of the money to donate to the local school, funding a new agricultural education program for students interested in farming and sustainability. He also made a generous contribution to the town's community center, which had long needed repairs. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. The townspeople began to view Jake not just as the guy who once owned a Ferrari, but as someone who had used his unexpected windfall to improve their shared home. He was approached by neighbors who offered their help, and even by some who asked for advice on small farming ventures of their own. Jake found himself at the center of a community-wide renewal, as others were inspired to invest in the town's future. One evening, as he was wrapping up work, Emily stopped by to see him. She'd heard about all he'd been doing and wanted to thank him personally. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. Emily looked at him with admiration, a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You've done something amazing, Jake. she said softly. "This town is better because of you. You could have taken that money and run, but instead, you gave it back to everyone here. That means more than any car ever could." Jake smiled, grateful for her words. He realized that through all of this, he'd found something far more valuable than any luxury. He'd found a purpose that felt true to who he was, and perhaps in the process, he'd also found a deeper connection with Emily, someone who understood his heart and shared his vision for a life grounded in simplicity and community. A few weeks later, the town held a small celebration to honor Jake and the improvements he'd funded. The community center had been repaired, the school's new program was set to start, and the local businesses had benefited from increased interest in their town. Jake attended, feeling a mix of pride and humility as he saw the impact of his decisions on the people around him. As the evening wound down, he noticed Hank approaching, a hesitant smile on his face. They hadn't talked much since the barbecue, but Hank extended a hand, and Jake shook it, feeling a sense of forgiveness pass between them. "I misjudged you, Jake," Hank admitted. "I thought that car had changed you. I should have known better." Jake clapped him on the shoulder, laughing. "I think I misjudged myself, Hank. I got caught up for a bit there, but I'm glad I found my way back. This land, this town, it's where I belong, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Later that night, as he walked back home, Jake reflected on everything that had happened. He knew he'd made the right choice, not only for himself, but for his entire community. The Ferrari had once seemed like a symbol of success, a glimpse into a life he'd never thought he'd experience. But now, he understood that true success lay not in what he owned, but in what he was able to give. Jake felt a profound sense of peace as he walked through the quiet streets, the stars shining brightly above him. He'd gained far more than he'd ever lost, and he'd come out of this experience with a renewed commitment to the values he held dear. His life might be simpler than Victor's, less glamorous perhaps, but it was rich in ways that truly mattered. And as he reached his farmhouse, the familiar sounds of the countryside welcoming him back, Jake knew he was right where he was meant to be. With the Ferrari sold and his life back on track, Jake found himself growing closer to Emily. They spent more time together, sharing quiet evenings on her porch, talking about their dreams and fears. Jake noticed how her presence brought him a calm he hadn't felt in years. Their friendship had blossomed into something deeper, and he felt a pull toward her that went beyond the comfort of familiarity. However, a lingering tension remained between them, one that neither had fully acknowledged. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Emily spoke up, breaking the silence. "Jake, I'm proud of everything you've done. You've made a real difference in this town. But I have to ask, what's next for you?" Jake looked at her, a bit taken aback. "What do you mean? This is it. The farm, the community. I'm right where I want to be." Emily hesitated, looking out over the fields. "I know, and I understand that, but I can't help but feel like there's a part of you that's still searching. You've had a taste of something different, and I wonder if it's left you wanting more. Not necessarily wealth, but something beyond the boundaries of this town." Jake considered her words, a slight unease settling in his chest. He'd thought he'd made peace with his decision to stay, but Emily's question brought up feelings he hadn't fully dealt with. "I think I found a sense of purpose here. But you're right. Sometimes I wonder what else is out there. Not for the sake of leaving, but to bring something back. To build something that lasts, like this community." Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's what I love about you, Jake. You're grounded, but you're not afraid to dream. Just promise me you'll keep that balance. I'd hate to see you lose yourself in someone else's vision again." Jake took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I won't. You've helped me see that, Emily. I wouldn't have made it through this without you." Inspired by Emily's words, Jake decided to use his newfound resources to create opportunities for others in the community. He hired local workers, including Hank, to help expand his farm, transforming it into a cooperative where neighbors could contribute and benefit. He set up a small business fund, offering interest-free loans to those wanting to start their own ventures, whether they were local crafts, organic produce, or other small enterprises. He wanted to foster a sense of ownership and pride among his neighbors, just as he felt for his own land. Hank, though initially hesitant, embraced the new role Jake offered him. Working side by side, the two friends rekindled their bond, rebuilding the trust that had been strained by the events surrounding the Ferrari. Hank proved invaluable, sharing his own ideas and helping Jake manage the new ventures. The farm became a bustling hub of activity, a place where the town's residents came together to work, learn, and grow. One day, as they loaded up crates of fresh produce for the town market, Hank looked at Jake, a genuine smile on his face. "You've really turned this place around, Jake. I'll admit, I was wrong about you. I thought that car would change you, but it seems like it just made you more of who you are." Jake chuckled, clapping Hank on the back. "Well, I couldn't have done it without friends like you. This town, it's always been my home. I just needed a reminder of what that truly means." Despite the positive changes, Jake sensed a growing rift with Emily. As the community projects took off, he found himself pulled in different directions, his time consumed by meetings, plans, and the responsibilities of managing the cooperative. Emily, while supportive, seemed distant at times, as if she were holding back. One evening, Jake invited her over, hoping to clear the air. They walked through the fields, the setting sun casting long shadows as he tried to bridge the gap between them. "Emily, I feel like I'm losing you. I know I've been busy, but you're a part of this too. Everything I'm doing here, it's for the future, for us." Emily stopped, turning to face him. "Jake, I've watched you pour yourself into this community, and I respect that. But I worry that you're giving so much of yourself that there won't be anything left for you, or for us. I've seen how things can change, how people can lose themselves in their ambitions. I don't want that to happen to you." Jake felt the weight of her words, a sinking feeling in his chest. He reached for her hands, searching her eyes for reassurance. "I won't let that happen. This place, the people, and you, it's all that matters to me. I've been reckless before, but I'm not chasing wealth or fame. I'm just trying to build something we can be proud of." Emily smiled softly, her expression filled with a mixture of love and concern. "I believe you, Jake. I really do. But promise me you'll remember that sometimes the people who matter most need your time and attention just as much as this town does." He nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. In that moment, he felt a deep resolve to find balance, to prioritize the things that grounded him. The journey had shown him many things, but above all, he realized that while he could give back to the community, he couldn't neglect the relationships that made his life meaningful. As they stood together, watching the last light fade over the farm, Jake knew he would always carry the lessons he'd learned. He had the love of his community, and most importantly, the love of a woman who saw him for who he truly was. This connection, this foundation, was his legacy, more enduring than any car, more lasting than any fleeting wealth. And as they walked back to the farmhouse together, hand in hand, Jake felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he had chosen a life of purpose and love. Just when life seemed to have settled, Jake received a surprising call one morning from Victor Reynolds. It had been weeks since they'd last spoken, and he'd assumed Victor had returned to his high-powered life in the city, far removed from the quiet existence Jake had embraced. But the tone of Victor's voice over the phone was tense, filled with an urgency that Jake hadn't heard before. "Jake, I need your help," Victor began, pausing as if trying to find the right words. "I'm in some trouble and I don't know who else to trust." Jake's curiosity was piqued, but he could also hear the desperation in Victor's voice. Without hesitation, he agreed to meet, sensing that this was more than just a casual request. They arranged to meet at Victor's estate, a sprawling property about an hour from Jake's farm. As Jake drove there, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more complicated than he imagined. When he arrived, Victor was waiting for him outside, pacing back and forth in his driveway. He looked more disheveled than Jake had ever seen him, the polished businessman facade replaced by a man clearly struggling with fear and uncertainty. He ushered Jake inside, speaking in hurried whispers, as if someone could be listening. Once they were seated, Victor took a deep breath, finally explaining. "Jake, I'm in a mess with some very dangerous people. I made some bad investments, deals I should never have touched. Now, they're threatening everything I have. I need someone I can trust to help me handle this. Someone who can remind me of who I am outside of all this." Jake listened, realizing that Victor's issues went deeper than just financial woes. This was a man who had tried to outrun his past and had instead run straight into a situation he couldn't control. Jake had never expected to find himself in the middle of a world of high-stakes deals and shady backroom negotiations, but here he was, feeling a strange sense of responsibility for the man who had once given him that Ferrari. Over the next few days, Jake stayed with Victor, helping him navigate the tangled web of threats and promises he had become ensnared in. Victor explained that he owed a substantial amount of money to a powerful group with connections to organized crime, and his only way out was to sell off assets he'd once held dear. However, his assets alone wouldn't be enough, and he feared for his life. Jake, unfamiliar with the dark world Victor was describing, listened closely, trying to understand the complexities of the situation. Victor was terrified, and Jake saw a vulnerability in him that he hadn't before. The billionaire facade had been stripped away, and underneath was a man who had lost himself in his pursuit of wealth, who now faced a real danger he couldn't handle alone. Jake offered to help, albeit in a way that felt true to his own nature. "Victor, I can't pretend I know much about dealing with these people, but what I do know is honesty and hard work. We can liquidate what you don't need, find a way to make this right. If you're willing to face this head-on, I'll stand by you. But you have to be willing to let go of the life that got you here." Victor nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You're right, Jake. I've been holding on to things that don't matter, things that have only brought me trouble. I'm ready to let it go, if that's what it takes to start over." Together, they mapped out a plan. Victor would sell off his remaining luxury cars, his vacation homes, and various assets tied to his business empire. The process was grueling, but with Jake's support, Victor began the slow task of extricating himself from the life that had ensnared him. They spent hours going through paperwork, making calls and coordinating sales, each step bringing Victor closer to the freedom he'd lost sight of. But the threats from the crime syndicate escalated, and Jake realized they needed more than just a financial solution. He suggested that they reach out to local authorities, but Victor, wary of the repercussions, hesitated. "Jake, these people don't work in the open. If they think I've brought the police into this, they'll come after everyone I care about." It was then that Jake proposed a solution rooted in his own values. "We stand up to them, Victor. Show them that you're not afraid to take responsibility. But you don't do it alone. We call a meeting, lay everything on the table, and make it clear that you're done with their games. I'll be there with you." The following evening, they met with the syndicate representatives at a neutral location Victor arranged. Jake stood by Victor's side as he faced the men, his voice steady as he explained his decision to sever ties and repay his debts on terms that wouldn't cost him his soul. At first, the men laughed, dismissing Victor's resolve. But Jake, who had stood up to challenges all his life, wasn't intimidated. He spoke plainly, with a calmness that conveyed a lifetime of honesty and strength. In the end, the syndicate agreed to Victor's terms, albeit reluctantly. As they left, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They had stood together, two men from vastly different worlds, bound by an unexpected friendship and a commitment to righting past wrongs.